The sea has always been a source of both beauty and danger, but nothing prepares you for the catastrophic moment when a seemingly routine operation turns into a horrifying disaster. Picture this: a massive tanker, an integral part of global trade, now becoming a ticking time bomb, with its crew unaware of the impending doom. But there was one person who knew, one person who saw the signs of a disaster waiting to happen. But they were laughed at. "You're being dramatic," they were told. "You worry too much." How could they have known? The very crew that dismissed the warning would soon pay the price for their complacency. The story of the tanker that became a fireball in the sea begins with that ignored warning. It wasn't the first time an issue like this had been raised, yet there was no response, no urgency, and the moment of reckoning was rapidly approaching. It all started with the tanker's design flaws. Long before the fateful day, a small group of engineers had voiced their concerns about safety measures. The tanker, while meeting the minimum standards of the time, wasn't exactly built to withstand the growing risks that came with modern fuel loads. The crew, too, had noticed things, oddities that didn't feel quite right. Strange vibrations in the hull, an unusual smell in the cargo hold, and a sense of instability when the ship was fully loaded. But no one listened. Why? Because the ship had been sailing fine for years. There was no immediate reason to panic. Besides, the company had made a name for itself in the industry. Their reputation was built on success, and success could only mean good decisions. Right, but this time, one person dared to speak out. This person wasn't a high-ranking officer. They weren't someone with power or influence. No, this was a junior engineer, someone who had been with the company for just a few years, and their warning was simple: there's something wrong with the ship. If we don't check this, we could face something catastrophic. It was a minor flaw in the system, something that could be easily fixed if only they'd listened. But instead, they were met with laughter, condescension, and dismissiveness. It was easy for those who hadn't spent countless hours working on the ship's inner mechanics to disregard the concerns. "Don't worry," they said, "everything is fine." And so, the tanker set out on its journey, as it had done so many times before. But the crew remained blissfully unaware of the ticking time bomb beneath their feet. Days passed, and then came the fateful morning. The tanker was fully loaded, as usual, and the crew was performing their tasks, unaware that within hours, their lives would be irrevocably changed. And all because of that one ignored warning, that single act of negligence. The moment that should have been prevented was now inevitable. As the day went on, the signs started to become apparent. First, there was a small incident in one of the tanks, a minor spark. It should have been contained easily, yet it wasn't. The ship was moving into a particularly volatile section of the sea, a place where temperature shifts could easily cause the chemicals inside the tanker to react. Yet, no one took action. They couldn't, because they believed it wasn't necessary. "It's just a glitch," they thought. But as the hours passed, the heat began to build. The chemicals in the tank began to react in ways that couldn't be stopped. What should have been a small, controlled fire quickly spiraled into an uncontrollable inferno. The ship's alarm system, outdated and barely functional, went off far too late. The crew scrambled into action, but the damage was done. It didn't take long for the flames to engulf the tanker, turning it into a fiery ball in the sea. The explosion that followed was heard miles away, shaking the very foundations of maritime safety. The sea, once calm, was now a violent battleground, with flames stretching high into the sky. Crew members, those who had laughed at the warning and dismissed it as overblown, now found themselves fighting for survival. But it was too late. The very ship they had trusted had become their tomb. A ship that could have been saved if only someone had listened. This is where the story truly begins. A disaster that could have been avoided. An incident that would go down in history as a reminder of the dangers of ignoring warning signs. The cost of complacency in an industry that has no room for error. If you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget to leave a comment, sharing your thoughts on what you think caused this industrial disaster. Do you believe the warnings were ignored, or was this tragedy unavoidable? Also, if you want to keep learning about these untold stories and the hidden causes behind industrial accidents, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Now, let's dive deeper into the next part of this story. It's easy to ignore small warnings when everything seems fine, but behind every major disaster, there are countless unnoticed signals, things that, if acted upon, could have averted tragedy. In the case of the tanker that turned into a fireball at sea, the signs were there. The crew, however, laughed them off. After all, the ship had been sailing for years without incident. Why worry now? The overconfidence in their own safety protocols blinded them to the risks. The ship had been built to last, with the best materials and technology of its time. However, technology evolves, and with it, so do the dangers. What was once cutting edge was now barely adequate. The world around the tanker was changing. Bigger ships, more dangerous cargoes, and more volatile chemicals. But the ship's design, though it met regulations, hadn't kept up with the times. It's common for sailors to get used to the feel of their vessel. The daily movements, the sound of the engines, the gentle sway of the waves, all familiar and comforting. However, over time, small anomalies are often dismissed as part of the job. The strange creaking noises from the hull, nothing out of the ordinary. The occasional burst of heat from the engine room, it happened before. But when every little issue becomes just another part of the routine, it's easy to overlook a problem that's growing larger by the day. And so, when the engineer raised concerns about the growing vibration beneath deck, no one took them seriously. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a warning, one that hinted at structural weaknesses. But rather than investigate, the crew laughed. A little vibration is nothing. It's just the sea. It happens to every ship, they said. But it wasn't the sea. It was a ticking clock, winding down with every turn of the engine. Then, the odd smells began to infiltrate the air, a pungent mixture of chemicals and something more ominous. Some of the crew joked about it, making light of the unusual scent. Probably just another cargo leak, one said. But another member of the crew knew better. They had seen similar signs before, in other ships, in other ports, where the ships had been condemned and sent for repairs. Yet here, no one wanted to believe that something more serious was afoot. These small, dismissible signs, combined with growing complacency, were the first cracks in what seemed like an indestructible vessel. No one wanted to rock the boat. The higher-ups, too, had their own reasons for keeping quiet. The ship was running smoothly on paper, and no one wanted to delay the schedule or halt the operation. Time was money, and money, as always, was the driving force. But behind the laughter, the ship's fate was sealed. The more the crew ignored the signs, the more the danger grew. As they sailed further into dangerous waters, the very problems they laughed off were silently building up, setting the stage for disaster. This wasn't just about equipment malfunction. It was about human error, about the refusal to acknowledge that something was wrong. And it all culminated in a moment of terror that no one saw coming. A moment when the ship, once just a piece of metal and machinery, turned into a ticking time bomb. The tanker, once a symbol of industry and commerce, was now a volatile beast waiting to explode. As the flames began to rise, the crew that had laughed at the warning found themselves trapped in the very ship they had once trusted. The disaster they thought impossible was now their reality. Every disaster is a series of miscalculations, some small and some that are monumental. For the ill-fated tanker, the series of errors leading up to the explosive catastrophe began long before the crew dismissed the warnings. It wasn't just about ignoring an engineer's concern or brushing off odd smells. It was about a dangerous accumulation of mistakes that compounded over time, errors in judgment, poor decision-making, and, perhaps most critically, the failure to update outdated protocols. The ship's design, built years ago, was never intended for the growing demands placed upon it. While it had successfully carried cargo across the seas for years, it was not built to handle the evolving complexity of modern fuels and chemicals. The weight of these materials, the pressures of modern shipping lanes, and the fluctuating weather conditions all placed strain on the tanker in ways that hadn't been fully accounted for in its original design. It's easy to assume that a ship of this magnitude, with a wet history, was immune to failures. But, as engineers knew well, neglecting regular updates and overlooking gradual wear and tear can lead to catastrophic consequences. The problem wasn't just mechanical failure. It was the sheer scale of miscalculations made during routine inspections and evaluations. One such miscalculation came during the loading procedure. The crew was accustomed to loading the tanker in the usual way, with no real consideration for how certain chemicals interacted with each other. The specific combinations used for this particular shipment were, in hindsight, disastrous. Chemical reactions that should have been checked for compatibility were ignored. Those tasked with inspecting the cargo focused instead on meeting the shipping deadline, as usual, and ensuring that the ship departed on time. Efficiency trumped caution. Meanwhile, the safety protocols, which had once been up to date, had started to fall behind. The ship's fire suppression systems were not designed for the extreme risks posed by modern high-density fuels. The technology on board was outdated, a factor that became increasingly apparent as the vessel made its way through stormier seas. Worse yet, the crew, who had long been accustomed to their specific roles, never thought to question the protocols. The traditional way of doing things, passed down from one crew to the next, felt safe despite the fact that the ship itself was no longer up to the task. As the ship journeyed through increasingly turbulent waters, a series of seemingly minor failures started to pile up. The fuel lines, which had been inspected only months before, began showing early signs of corrosion. A minor spark from the engine room, unnoticed by the crew, could have been enough to trigger the disaster. Yet, instead of shutting down operations or conducting a full inspection, the crew simply made temporary fixes, dismissing them as minor issues that would not interfere with their duties. All the while, the crew continued their day-to-day routines, oblivious to the ticking clock that was slowly inching toward the inevitable. The further they went, the more vulnerable the ship became. The seemingly small errors accumulated, transforming into a massive vulnerability that would not be easily rectified. The complacency that had crept into their actions, from overlooking safety warnings to making shortcuts in maintenance, was the precise recipe for disaster. The ultimate miscalculation, however, was the assumption that everything would be fine because it had always been fine before. The assumption that the ship's previous voyages had somehow set a precedent for future success, even in the face of mounting evidence that the vessel wasn't what it once was. It wasn't a matter of bad luck, it was a collection of bad decisions that set the stage for what would become a devastating explosion. In the world of heavy industry and maritime operations, there's a saying that the smallest detail can make the biggest difference. Yet, time and again, critical details are overlooked or dismissed, often with disastrous consequences. The tanker that exploded in the sea was no exception. While the crew had made countless miscalculations and the design of the vessel itself had been questioned, the true catalyst for the explosion was a single, overlooked detail. A detail so seemingly insignificant that no one even thought to check it until it was too late. It all came down to one overlooked safety measure: the fire suppression system. The very system that was supposed to save the ship and its crew in the event of an emergency had been inadequately maintained for years. The system's pipes had been corroding, and the seals were starting to wear thin. Small repairs had been made, but no one had thought to conduct a comprehensive overhaul of the system in recent years. It was simply too expensive, and the ship had been sailing smoothly. But this wasn't just an issue of out of sight, out of mind. It was the result of institutional neglect, where cost-saving measures prioritized profit over safety. The fire suppression system was just one part of a wider issue, a culture of neglect that permeated the entire operation. The safety protocols, once state-of-the-art, had become outdated, the inspections had become less frequent, and the importance of safety had become less of a priority as the company became more focused on minimizing downtime and increasing efficiency. In fact, the very people responsible for ensuring safety, the engineers, the inspectors, the officers in charge, had all become desensitized to the risks. After all, nothing catastrophic had ever happened before. It wasn't until the tanker was mid-journey, deep into the voyage, that the crew began to notice strange things happening with the systems that were meant to keep them safe. The fire suppression system, though still operational in some capacity, had a noticeable delay when activated. The pressure gauges for the cooling system began to rise faster than expected. It should have been an immediate red flag, but instead of shutting down the operation, the crew simply adjusted the settings, reasoning that it was just another routine issue. They had become so accustomed to working around problems that they no longer viewed them as dangerous. The final straw, however, came when a small fire started in one of the fuel tanks. Under normal conditions, the fire suppression system would have been triggered almost instantly, but with the neglect of the system's components, it took too long for the suppression to activate, allowing the fire to spread much faster than anticipated. As the crew scrambled to respond, the situation quickly escalated from a minor issue to a full-blown disaster. The crew's attempts to contain the fire were futile. and what was once a manageable situation had now become an uncontrollable blaze. The reason why this fire became an inferno wasn't because of bad luck, it was because of the neglect that had been allowed to fester over the years. The warning signs had been there, the system's delayed response, the increasing pressure in the tanks, the strange smells in the air. But the crew, like so many before them, had ignored these small red flags, thinking they could manage. They never realized that the accumulation of these overlooked details was building up to the inevitable disaster that would cost them everything. And when the fire did finally break out in full force, it didn't just spread to the tanks, it spread throughout the entire vessel, as the fire suppression system failed to activate in time, and the ship's crew, once too confident in their ability to handle the situation, was now in a race against the clock. The very detail they had neglected for years, the safety systems that were supposed to save them, had now become their death sentence. Disasters don't announce themselves, they strike when you least expect it, and the explosion that turned the tanker into a fireball at sea is a perfect example. What started as a minor malfunction quickly spiraled into an inferno that engulfed the entire vessel. It wasn't just an accident, it was a series of cascading failures, each one feeding the other, until the tanker became a massive ball of fire on the open sea, leaving destruction in its wake. The first spark was small, almost unnoticeable, a tiny flare from an overheating pump in one of the tanks, something that could have easily been contained if the ship's safety systems had been functioning properly. The fire suppression system, which had failed to activate when needed, had left the crew to fight the flames with manual extinguishers. But by the time they reached the source of the fire, it was too late. The flames had already spread to the surrounding tanks, fueling the fire and causing a rapid chain reaction. What happened next was like something from a nightmare. Within minutes, the fire had breached the hull, igniting the volatile chemicals inside. As the fire burned hotter, the pressure in the cargo hold reached critical levels, and that's when the unthinkable happened, an explosion. The force was so immense that it shook the very ocean beneath the tanker, sending a shockwave through the nearby vessels. The tanker, once a giant in the sea, was now a flaming wreck, its cargo turned into an inferno. The explosion sent flames shooting high into the air, visible for miles, a terrifying signal of the disaster unfolding in reality. Crew members who had not been able to escape in time were caught in the blast, some of them thrown into the sea, while others were trapped below deck. Panic spread quickly, and the few survivors who managed to find lifeboats could only watch as the massive fireball consumed the ship, a stark reminder of how quickly disaster can strike when safety protocols are ignored and neglected. For those who had laughed at the early warnings, the explosion was a brutal wake-up call. It wasn't just the fire that killed, it was the sheer force of the blast. The ship, once brimming with life, was now reduced to floating debris. The sea, which had always seemed calm and predictable, had turned into a scene of chaos and destruction. The aftermath of the explosion was nothing short of catastrophic. The fire raged for hours, with the remains of the tanker still burning on the horizon. Rescuers arrived on the scene too late to save most of the crew. What remained of the ship was now a charred skeleton, the destruction almost complete. What could have been a minor incident had now become one of the most devastating maritime disasters in recent history. The failure of safety systems, combined with the crew's disregard for the early warning signs, had resulted in a tragedy that could have been avoided if only the small details had been addressed sooner. The explosion, like many other disasters, was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of negligence, complacency, and the refusal to acknowledge the mounting dangers until it was too late. As the tanker exploded into a fireball, the immediate aftermath was chaos, both on board and in the waters surrounding it. The explosion left the ship burning and slowly sinking into the sea, while the once controlled environment of the tanker transformed into a war zone. The crew, caught in the midst of the inferno, faced a fight for survival as flames, smoke, and debris threatened to claim their lives at every turn. The only thing standing between them and certain death was the strength of their will to survive. The crew's initial reaction was panic, understandably so. Those not immediately caught in the blast scrambled to escape the raging fire. The sound of the explosion still reverberated in their ears, adding to the chaos as they tried to make their way to safety. Some raced to lifeboats, while others attempted to find cover in whatever small corners. The ship was still intact, but the fire was relentless, consuming everything in its path. The deck, once a bustling hub of activity, was now an inferno, leaving the crew to fend for themselves. Time was not on their side. With the fire spreading rapidly, the crew had to make decisions quickly. The ship's emergency alarms, which should have guided them to safety, were either malfunctioning or too late to be of any use. Those who had prepared for a disaster were, unfortunately, the minority. Many were caught off guard, unprepared for such a catastrophic event, and the lack of proper emergency drills only compounded the disaster. As the ship sank deeper into the sea, the crew's desperate fight for survival became increasingly difficult. The lifeboats, often the only means of escape, were now the most contested resource on the ship. With only a limited number available, the scramble for these lifeboats was fierce. Some made it, while others were left behind, forced to jump into the sea and swim for their lives as the tanker continued to burn. The sea itself, which had always been a source of hope for the crew's safety, now became another peril. The waves were high, and the surrounding area was full of floating debris. Those who managed to escape the flames were at the mercy of the ocean, fighting to stay afloat, while also battling exhaustion and panic. Some were injured, their chances of survival becoming slimmer by the minute. Amid this chaos, a few crew members displayed extraordinary courage and leadership. They organized makeshift rescue efforts, using whatever resources were available to aid those still trapped on the burning ship. But their efforts were hampered by the fire and the overwhelming sense of desperation that had gripped the survivors. For many, the realization had set in that they were witnessing the end of their journey. What had once been an ordinary, seemingly safe voyage had turned into a nightmare beyond imagination. And even as rescue ships began to arrive, it was too late for many. The damage had been done, and what had once been a thriving vessel, carrying goods across the seas, was now reduced to a burning wreck, with only a handful of survivors left clinging to life. The once ignored warning, the miscalculations, the neglected details, all of them had led to this moment of sheer devastation. The aftermath of the tanker explosion was nothing short of catastrophic, not only for the crew members who had fought to survive, but also for the entire maritime industry. The explosion, which was once unimaginable, became the spark that ignited a global debate about safety standards, emergency protocols, and the oversight of maritime operations. This disaster wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a turning point that would reshape how the industry operated forever. As the survivors were rescued and brought ashore, the full extent of the damage became evident. The once pristine vessel, now reduced to smoldering wreckage, served as a grim reminder of how quickly a seemingly routine voyage could turn into a nightmare. In the days following the explosion, investigators descended upon the scene, searching for answers and hoping to piece together the chain of events that had led to the disaster. What they discovered was far more troubling than anyone had anticipated. The first thing that became apparent was the complete failure of the ship's safety systems. These systems, which were supposed to prevent exactly this type of disaster, had failed at almost every turn. The fire suppression system, as previously mentioned, had been outdated and malfunctioning, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. Other safety measures, from the emergency evacuation protocols to the onboard training of the crew, had been inadequate. Worse still, it became clear that these deficiencies had been flagged years before the disaster occurred, but were repeatedly ignored or downplayed by the company and the ship's officers. The explosion itself, while horrific, had also been a result of something far more preventable. The ship's outdated design and lack of modern safety features had combined with the crew's failure to heed minor warning signs to create the perfect storm of disaster. The tragedy highlighted the gaps in the maritime industry's regulations, which, at the time, allowed ships like this one to operate with outdated systems and insufficient safety measures. But the most shocking revelation was the realization that this disaster could have been prevented if the company and the crew had taken the necessary precautions and acted on the concerns that had been raised. As news of the explosion spread, the public outrage was palpable. People began to demand accountability, and governments around the world took notice. The disaster had exposed critical flaws in the way the maritime industry operated, and the industry could no longer ignore the fact that its safety standards were woefully inadequate. The aftermath of the explosion would become the catalyst for a series of changes in maritime safety regulations. International regulations were soon revised to address the weaknesses exposed by the disaster. New safety standards were enacted, focusing on everything from the structural integrity of ships to the training and certification of crew members. Companies were now required to invest in more modern, effective safety systems, and those systems were regularly tested to ensure they were up to the task. Emergency protocols were overhauled, and it became mandatory for crew members to undergo regular, realistic training to prepare for the worst. The maritime industry, once content with operating under outdated safety measures, had been forced to adapt. The disaster had forever changed the way the world viewed maritime operations, and the regulations that followed became the gold standard for ensuring that no other ship would meet the same fate. In every tragedy, there are those who see the storm approaching but are often too powerless to stop it. Some might warn others, but their voices are drowned out by the noise of overconfidence, complacency, and ignorance. The story of the tanker explosion is no different. One person, in particular, stood up against the tide of skepticism and dismissal, trying to warn the crew and the higher-ups of the impending danger. Their actions, which ultimately cost them dearly, were the last line of defense in a disaster waiting to happen. This person wasn't an officer with decades of experience, nor a top executive with immense power and influence. No, this was a junior engineer, someone with little authority, but a deep understanding of the ship's systems. They had seen the signs, the strange vibrations, the strange smells, the misaligned systems, and they knew that something was dangerously wrong. But they were dismissed, laughed at, and ignored by the very people whose responsibility it was to keep the ship safe. At first, they tried to raise the issue informally, a quick word with a colleague here, a suggestion made in passing there, but it quickly became clear that the crew wasn't listening. "Don't worry, everything is fine," they were told. "You're overreacting." It wasn't just the ship's officers who dismissed their concerns. The company itself had long been complacent, ignoring small red flags in favor of keeping operations running smoothly. Safety was important, of course, but profits, schedules, and maintaining the image of a flawless operation were at the forefront of the company's priorities. Despite the lack of support, this engineer didn't give up. They went further, compiling data, making a formal report to the higher-ups, outlining the potential dangers, and asking for a full inspection of the ship. They were met with resistance, of course, but the engineer persisted, trying to ensure that the vessel would undergo the repairs it desperately needed. Yet, despite their best efforts, the powers that be refused to act. They didn't want to risk a delay in operations, and so, the warnings were pushed aside. The engineer's persistence, however, didn't go unnoticed. Some of the crew, who had begun to sense the growing danger, started quietly supporting the engineer, but they too were powerless to effect change. They were all just passengers in a system that had already made up its mind. It wasn't until the disaster had already struck, when the tanker erupted into flames and became a fireball in the sea, that the full weight of the engineer's warnings became evident. And by then, it was too late. In the chaos following the explosion, this engineer's role was forgotten by many, overshadowed by the tragedy itself. Yet, their story is one of quiet heroism. They saw what others refused to see, and took action, knowing full well that their warnings might not be heeded. They risked their career, their reputation, and ultimately their peace of mind, all for the safety of others. In the end, they were not vindicated until the damage had already been done, and even then, it was overshadowed by the need to rebuild the company's image. Behind every industrial disaster, there's a hidden truth about the design flaws that made the event not only possible but inevitable. The tanker that exploded was, at first glance, a marvel of modern engineering, built to carry massive quantities of fuel across vast distances. Yet, beneath its surface, there were multiple secrets that had been kept hidden from the crew, from the regulators, and perhaps even from the company itself. The tanker's design, once a symbol of cutting-edge technology, was ultimately its downfall. The first secret lay in the materials used to construct the ship. While the tanker was designed with the best materials available at the time, advances in technology had quickly made those materials obsolete. The hull, designed to withstand the pressures of the sea, was now ill-suited for the increased weight and chemical volatility of modern cargo. Over time, the hull's integrity had been compromised by the weight of the cargo it was carrying, and the wear and tear from regular use had left it vulnerable to leaks and cracks. Yet, these issues were brushed aside, as the ship was still performing well on the surface. It was a situation that was easy to ignore, but one that had been building toward a catastrophic failure. Next was the issue of the ship's internal systems, which were outdated and undermined. The fire suppression system, the heart of any tanker's safety infrastructure, had been designed years ago, based on older standards. As technology had evolved, so too had the risks associated with modern fuels and chemicals. The tanker's system was designed for a different era, one where the types of chemicals being carried were less volatile and easier to contain. However, as the ship began carrying more hazardous materials, the fire suppression system failed to keep up with the increased danger. The system was slow to react, often failing to activate until it was too late, and when it did activate, it was inefficient. The engineers who had designed the system had no way of predicting the kind of explosion that would occur when modern fuels reacted with the heat and pressure inside the tanks. Another secret was the tanker's outdated safety protocols. While these protocols may have been sufficient at the time the ship was first built, they were no longer fit for purpose. The crew had been trained on older procedures that hadn't been updated to reflect the changing risks posed by the cargo the ship was now carrying. In addition, the crew's familiarity with the ship, along with a false sense of security, meant that they didn't always follow the protocols strictly. In an industry where failure to follow safety guidelines can mean disaster, this complacency was a fatal flaw. Even more alarming were the blind spots in the ship's design that were never fully addressed. The engineers and designers had assumed that certain systems, like the electrical wiring, fuel lines, and cargo storage areas, would function as intended under normal conditions. But over time, the strain from the growing size of the tanker and the increasing pressure of the cargo had exposed flaws in these systems that no one had anticipated. The wiring, which had once been protected by the ship's outer layers, had become increasingly exposed to wear and tear, and the fuel lines, which were meant to be tightly sealed, began to leak under pressure. These leaks, when combined with small sparks and overheating equipment, became the ignition points for the eventual explosion. The ship's design was a mixture of outdated technology, neglected maintenance, and overconfidence. It wasn't that the ship was inherently faulty from the start, but rather that the company and the regulators had allowed it to sail without considering the mounting risks. There were warning signs, of course, but the company and its crew refused to act on them, preferring to trust the old design and outdated systems rather than making the necessary upgrades. The result was a disaster waiting to happen, a ticking time bomb that ultimately claimed lives and caused one of the worst industrial accidents in maritime history. The devastating explosion that turned the tanker into a fireball was not just a catastrophic event for those directly involved. It was a moment that forever changed the landscape of the maritime industry, sparking a global revaluation of safety protocols and regulations. The legacy of this disaster would echo through the corridors of industrial operations for years to come, serving as a grim reminder of the importance of safety, innovation, and vigilance in an industry where the stakes couldn't be higher. In the aftermath of the disaster, the immediate focus was on rescue operations and recovery, but soon, the larger question emerged: how could this tragedy have been prevented? The investigation into the explosion revealed systemic failures at every level, from the ship's design to the company's approach to maintenance, from outdated safety systems to a corporate culture that prioritized efficiency over precaution. It became clear that the disaster wasn't the result of a single mistake, but rather a series of compounding errors, each one reinforcing the next. The industry's failure to address these risks in a timely manner had resulted in one of the worst maritime disasters in recent memory. But from the ashes of the disaster, change began to take root. Governments around the world, along with international maritime organizations, took immediate action to overhaul safety standards. What followed was a sweeping set of regulations aimed at ensuring that such an event could never happen again. Fire suppression systems were updated, with newer technologies designed to react faster and more effectively in the event of an emergency. The structure and design of tankers were re-evaluated, with stricter guidelines on safety margins, cargo compatibility, and ship integrity. Perhaps the most significant change came in the form of new crew training protocols. The explosion highlighted just how ill-prepared the crew was for such a crisis. Emergency drills were mandatory, and crew members were now trained to handle real-life disaster scenarios, ensuring they were ready to respond to any emergency, no matter how severe. The idea that safety protocols were merely guidelines to follow if there's time was abandoned in favor of making them an integral part of daily operations, to be practiced as routinely as the ship's engine maintenance. On an even broader scale, the tragedy also sparked a cultural shift in the maritime industry. Companies could no longer afford to operate on the assumption that it won't happen to us. The explosion became a wake-up call, urging an industry-wide re-evaluation of risk management. Regulators began to demand transparency, with companies required to disclose their safety records and outline their contingency plans for any potential disaster. The idea of risk management went from being a theoretical concept to a practical, enforceable part of running a shipping operation. And yet, despite all the changes, the tragedy remained a dark chapter in the history of maritime transport. The tanker's explosion was a stark reminder of what happens when complacency takes hold. It showed the world the consequences of overlooking small details, of ignoring warnings, and of placing profits and speed over human life. The legacy of the explosion was not just in the regulations that followed, but in the industry's renewed commitment to never forgetting the cost of negligence. For the survivors, the lesson was personal. They carried the weight of that day with them for the rest of their lives, haunted by the voices of their fallen colleagues and the image of the burning ship. For them, the changes in regulations were a bittersweet victory, a recognition that their tragedy had at least sparked some change in the system that failed them. If you've made it this far, thank you for following the entire journey of this tragic event. We've seen how one disaster changed the course of an entire industry. But the real question remains, how many more disasters must occur before we truly learn from the past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story insightful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. And if you want to dive into another shocking story, be sure to watch the next video that's coming up on your screen right now.